His hand remained suspended in the air between them, neither offered nor withdrawn. And in that fraction of breath she understood that every choice from this moment forward would carry a weight she could not yet measure. The candle flame bent sideways as if pulled by an invisible thread, and somewhere in the vast house a door closed with the finality of a sentence pronounced. She did not move. Neither did he. The silence held them both in a grip more certain than any touch. Before we dive into this story, leave your rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're watching from. May this moment reach your heart. The carriage had travelled through rain for 3 days before it arrived at Blackthorn Hall, and by the time the wheels ground to a halt on the gravel drive, Elara Winters had memorised every creak of the axle, every sway that pressed her shoulder against the cold leather. She stepped down into mud that claimed her boots immediately, the kind of earth that remembered everything it touched. The house rose before her like a monument to something long finished, its windows narrow and watching, its stone face darkened by centuries of weather and something else she could not name. The air smelled of wet leaves and iron. She had been summoned by letter. Though summoned felt like too strong a word for the careful phrasing that had reached her at the charity school where she had lived since childhood. The letter spoke of a position, a companion for an elderly aunt, room and board, and a small wage. It had been signed by the master of the house himself, though the handwriting had been elegant to the point of illegibility. She had accepted because there was nothing to refuse for, no other door standing open, no other voice calling her name into a future that held more than the grey walls and greyer bread of the institution that had raised her. A servant met her at the door, a woman whose face seemed carved from the same stone as the house, expression neither welcoming nor cold but simply present. She took Elara's single bag without comment and led her inside, through corridors that stretched longer than seemed possible from the outside, past paintings whose subjects seemed to turn their heads as she passed. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting her uncertain steps back at her in dark parody. Somewhere deep in the house, a clock struck 4, the sound reverberating through walls thick enough to hold secrets for generations. The room they gave her was on the 3rd floor, tucked into a corner where 2 wings met at an awkward angle. It was small but furnished with more care than anywhere she had ever slept. A narrow bed with clean linens, a writing desk near the window, a wardrobe that stood empty and waiting. The window looked out over the gardens, or what had once been gardens, now a tangle of overgrown hedges and paths disappearing into shadow. Beyond that, the moors stretched to the horizon, dark and rolling like a restless sea frozen in earth and heather. She was told that dinner would be brought to her room, that she would meet the aunt in the morning, that the master of the house was away on business and would return within the week. The servant delivered this information in the same flat tone she might use to describe the weather, then left Elara alone with the sound of her own breathing and the gradual dimming of daylight against the window glass. That first night she did not sleep. The house spoke in a language of settling beams and distant footsteps, of wind finding its way through cracks she could not see. She lay in the narrow bed and listened, trying to separate the sounds into categories of the ordinary and the strange, but they all felt strange here. All weighted with meaning she had not yet learned to read. Once, near midnight, she heard music, faint and melancholy, coming from somewhere far below. A piano, she thought, playing something that sounded like grief translated into minor keys. Then it stopped, abrupt as a door closing, and the silence that followed was somehow louder than the music had been. In the morning she met Aunt Constance, a woman who sat in a wheeled chair by a window in the east wing, wrapped in shawls despite the fire burning in the grate. Her face was pale as paper, her hands thin and trembling slightly where they rested on the arms of the chair. But her eyes were sharp, alert, moving over Elara with an assessment that felt almost surgical in its precision. "You are younger than I expected," the aunt said, her voice surprisingly strong for such a fragile frame. "And plainer. That is good. Beauty causes complications here." Elara did not know how to respond to this, so she said nothing, standing with her hands folded in front of her the way she had been taught at the school, waiting for instruction. "You will read to me in the afternoons," Aunt Constance continued. "Mornings you are free to do as you please within reason. Do not go into the West Wing. Do not enter rooms that are locked. Do not ask questions about things that do not concern you. My nephew is a private man, and this is a private house. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Ilara said, though she understood very little, except that there were rules here, invisible lines she must not cross. "Good. We shall begin after lunch." "You may go." Ilara spent the morning exploring the permissible areas of the house, mapping the corridors and rooms that were open to her. The library drew her immediately. A vast room lined floor to ceiling with books, their spines cracked and faded, smelling of leather and age and the particular dust that accumulates only around stored knowledge. She pulled down volume after volume, reading titles and opening pages at random, losing herself in the familiar comfort of words on paper. Here at least was something she understood, something that did not shift or speak in riddles. It was in the library that she first saw him, though she did not realize who he was at first. She had climbed the rolling ladder to reach a volume on the highest shelf and was balanced precariously when she felt the sudden certainty that she was no longer alone. She looked down and found a man standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression she could not read. He was tall, dressed in black that seemed to absorb the light around him, his face angular and pale, his hair dark and pulled back from a forehead that spoke of nobility or arrogance or both. But it was his eyes that held her grey as winter storms, unblinking, fixed on her with an intensity that made her grip the ladder tighter. "You must be Miss Winters," he said, and his voice was low, controlled, the kind of voice that never needed to rise to command attention. "Yes, sir," she managed, though her throat had gone suddenly dry. "I am Lucian Blackthorne. This is my house." She knew she should climb down, should curtsy, should do something other than cling to the ladder like a child caught stealing, but she found she could not move. He continued to watch her, and in that gaze she felt measured, assessed, catalogued in some way that went beyond the social pleasantries of introduction. "My aunt speaks well of you," he said, though they had spent perhaps an hour together total. "I trust you will be comfortable here." It was not a question, so she did not answer. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture that might have been a bow or a dismissal or something else entirely, then turned and left as silently as he had arrived. Ilara remained on the ladder for several minutes after he had gone, her heart beating hard enough that she could feel it in her fingertips where they gripped the wood. The afternoons with Aunt Constance fell into a pattern. Ilara would read aloud from whatever book the old woman selected, usually poetry or philosophy, occasionally novels that seemed chosen more for their melancholy than their plots. The aunt rarely interrupted, sitting with her eyes half closed, her breathing shallow and measured. Sometimes Ilara wondered if she was actually listening or simply enjoying the sound of another voice in the room, filling the silence that otherwise pressed so heavily on the house. The evenings were different. Dinner was served in the main dining hall, a room too large for the three of them, the table stretching away into shadow despite the candles burning at intervals along its length. Lucian sat at the head, Aunt Constance to his right, Ilara near the middle where she could be seen but not prominent. They ate in near silence, the only sounds the clink of silver on china, the occasional murmur of a servant offering more wine or removing a plate. But beneath the silence, Ilara felt the weight of observation. Lucian rarely looked at her directly, but she could sense his attention, the way one senses being watched in the dark. Sometimes his aunt would make a comment, some small observation about the weather or the food, and Ilara would respond briefly, aware always of the third presence at the table, the man who said nothing but seemed to hear everything. On the fifth night, after the servants had cleared the table and Aunt Constance had retired to her rooms, Lucian spoke to her for the first time since that moment in the library. "Walk with me," he said, rising from his chair. It was not a request. Ilara stood, her napkin falling forgotten to the floor, and followed him through the corridors to a set of glass doors that opened onto a stone terrace. The night was cold, the stars sharp as pins in a black velvet sky. She had not brought a shawl, and the chill raised goosebumps along her arms immediately. He walked to the edge of the terrace and stood looking out over the gardens, his hands clasped behind his back. She remained near the doors. uncertain whether she was meant to follow or simply wait. "You are afraid of me," he said, not turning. "No, sir," she lied. "Yes, you are. Everyone here is afraid of me. It is how things work in this house." He turned then, and in the moonlight, his face looked carved from marble, beautiful and cold and utterly still. "I do not mind fear. It keeps things orderly. But you are different." "How, sir?" "Your fear is not of me. It is of yourself." The words struck something in her chest, true and terrible. She wanted to deny it, but found she could not speak. He took a step toward her, then another, moving with a grace that seemed almost unnatural, as if he did not quite touch the ground. When he stopped, he was close enough that she could see the faint pulse at his throat, proof that beneath the stillness, he was alive. However, barely. "Why did you come here, Miss Winters?" he asked softly. "I was invited, sir." "That is not what I asked." She met his eyes then, forced herself to hold that grey gaze, even though every instinct screamed at her to look away. "I had nowhere else to go." Something flickered across his face, too quick to name. Honesty. How refreshing. He raised one hand, and for a moment she thought he might touch her, but instead he gestured back toward the doors. "You should go inside. The cold here is not kind to those unaccustomed to it." She fled, though she tried to make it look like a measured retreat, back through the corridors to her small room where she stood shaking by the window, watching the terrace below until his dark figure finally turned and disappeared back into the house. The days began to blur together, each one a repetition of the last with only small variations. Morning solitude, afternoon readings, evening dinners waited with unspoken things. But beneath the routine, something was shifting. She felt it in the way the servants looked at her now, a mixture of pity and warning in their glances. She felt it in Aunt Constance's increasing silences, the way the old woman would pause in the middle of a sentence and simply stare at Elara as if seeing something she had not noticed before. And she felt it most of all in Lucian's presence, which seemed to grow more constant even when he was not in the room. She would turn a corner and catch the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. She would enter the library and find a book left open on the table, marked at a poem about longing and loss. Small things, perhaps meaningless, perhaps deliberate. She could not tell, and not knowing made every moment feel charged with possibility. It was on a night when rain lashed the windows with unusual violence that everything changed. Elara had been reading in her room, trying to ignore the storm, when a knock came at her door. She opened it to find one of the servants, a young woman named Sarah, whose face looked strained in the dim hallway light. "The master requests your presence in the music room." "Miss," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now? At this hour?" "Yes, miss." He was quite clear. Elara followed Sarah down through the house, past the familiar corridors into sections she had never explored. The music room was in the south wing, a space she had glimpsed once through an open door but never entered. Sarah left her at the threshold, scurrying away as if eager to be gone. The room was lit by a single candelabra on top of a grand piano, the flames casting shadows that moved like living things across the walls. Lucian sat at the piano bench, his fingers resting on the keys but not playing. He did not look up when she entered. "Close the door," he said. She did, the click of the latch sounding too loud in the stillness. "Come here." She crossed the room slowly, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. When she reached the piano, she stood at a careful distance, waiting. "Do you play?" he asked. "No, sir. I was never taught." "Pity. Music is the only honest language." He pressed a single key, a low note that resonated through the room and seemed to vibrate in her chest. "Sit with me." There was barely room on the bench, and when she sat, her shoulder brushed against his. He did not move away. The warmth of him was startling after so much coldness, and she found herself acutely aware of every point where their bodies almost touched. "I am going to play something," he said. "I want you to listen. Not with your ears, with everything else." His hands moved to the keys and sound filled the room. It was the same melody she had heard that first night, but closer now, more intimate. The music was dark and complex, full of longing and something that might have been rage, contained just barely, controlled with effort. She closed her eyes, let it wash over her, felt it settle into her bones. When the last note faded, the silence felt different than before, heavier, more dangerous. "That is what this house sounds like," Lucian said quietly. "That is what I sound like. Can you hear it?" "Yes," she whispered, because it was true. He turned to look at her, and in the candlelight his face was no longer cold but burning with something she had no name for. "You should leave this place, Miss Winters, before it is too late." "Why?" "Because I am not a good man. Because this house takes things and does not give them back. Because if you stay, I will destroy you without meaning to." She should have been frightened. Every rational part of her mind screamed that this was the moment to run, to pack her single bag and walk out into the storm and never look back. But beneath the fear was something else, something that recognized the music in him because it matched the music in her. The same dark melody of loneliness and hunger for something more than survival. "I am already destroyed, sir," she said, meeting his eyes. "There is nothing left to take." His hand moved to her face, his fingers cold against her cheek, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across a distance that was no distance at all. Then he pulled away, stood abruptly, nearly knocking over the candelabra. "Go to your room," he said, his voice rough. "Go now." She went, but she knew that something had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. The house felt different as she climbed the stairs, not safer but more honest. The shadows were still shadows, but they no longer pretended to be anything else. The next morning, Aunt Constance did not send for her. Instead, a note was slipped under Ilara's door, written in the old woman's shaking hand. It said simply, "Be careful, child. Some hungers cannot be fed without consuming everything." Ilara burned the note in her candle flame and watched the paper curl into ash. The days that followed were marked by a tension that vibrated through every moment. Lucian avoided her at meals, taking his dinner in his study or not appearing at all. But she would find evidence of his attention everywhere. A new dress appeared in her wardrobe, deep green velvet that fit perfectly though she had never been measured. Books would materialize on her bedside table, always open to passages that seemed chosen specifically for her. Once she found a hothouse rose on her pillow, dark red and perfect, already beginning to wilt. She did not know what game was being played, or if it was a game at all. The servants watched her with increasing wariness, as if she had been marked by something they could see but she could not. Sarah stopped meeting her eyes. The cook left her portions larger than necessary, as if trying to strengthen her for some coming trial. And through it all, the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. It was Lady Constance who finally broke the silence, calling Ilara to her rooms on an afternoon when rain fell steady and grey against the windows. The old woman looked more fragile than ever, propped up by pillows, her skin translucent in the dim light. "Sit, child," she said, gesturing to a chair nearby. Ilara sat, her hands folded in her lap. "I am dying," Constance said matter-of-factly. "Not today, perhaps not even this month, but soon. The doctors have said as much and I can feel it in my bones. Before I go, there are things you must know. You do not have to..." Silence. Listen. The old woman's eyes were fierce despite her weakness. "My nephew is not like other men. His father was cruel, his mother was cold, and he was raised in this house like a prince in a prison. He learned early that love was weakness, that attachment was pain. He has spent his life building walls, and those walls have made him powerful but empty. Do you understand what I am telling you?" "I think so," Ilara said quietly. "No, you do not. You think you can save him. You think your love will be enough to break through those walls. But child, some people are not meant to be saved. Some people will pull you down into their darkness rather than let you pull them into your light." "Then why did you bring me here?" Constance's laugh was bitter. "Because I am a foolish old woman who hoped I might be wrong. Because I thought perhaps someone as broken as you might understand someone as broken as him. Because I wanted to see before I died if there was any hope left in this cursed house." She reached out with one trembling hand and grasped Ilara's wrist with surprising strength. "But I was wrong. You must leave, tonight if possible, before you become what this place wants you to become." "And what is that?" "A ghost, like all the rest of us. Ilara pulled her hand free gently. I cannot leave. I have nowhere to go. Then God help you, child. God help you both. That evening, Ilara did not go down to dinner. She stayed in her room watching the rain and thinking about walls and darkness and the particular kind of prison that comes from having nothing left to lose. She thought about the music Lucian had played, the way it had sounded like grief and hunger tangled together. She thought about her own life, the long years of grey walls and careful silence, of never being quite enough to be noticed, but too much to be forgotten. Perhaps, Constance was right, perhaps she should leave. But leaving required somewhere to go, and the only direction she could see was backward, into a past that held nothing for her. She was still at the window when the knock came. Not Sarah this time, but Lucian himself, standing in her doorway with rain in his hair and something desperate in his eyes. Come with me, he said. Where? It does not matter. Just come. She followed him through the house and out into the storm, the rain soaking through her dress in seconds. He led her across the gardens to a small structure she had never noticed before, hidden behind overgrown hedges. A greenhouse, she realized as he pulled open the door, though most of the glass was broken and rain dripped through the gaps in the ceiling. Inside, surrounded by wild growth and the smell of wet earth, he finally stopped and turned to face her. I do not know how to do this, he said, his voice raw. I do not know how to be anything other than what I am. Then be what you are, she said simply. You do not understand. What I am will hurt you. What I am has hurt everyone who ever... He stopped, shook his head. I should not have brought you here. To this house, to this moment. I should have left well enough alone. She stepped closer, close enough to see the rain on his face, to count his rapid breaths. But you did bring me here. And I stayed. That has to mean something. His hands came up to frame her face, and she felt the trembling in his fingers, the barely contained need. It means we are both fools. Then let us be fools together. When he kissed her, it was not gentle. It was hunger and desperation and years of denied wanting, all compressed into a single moment. She kissed him back with equal intensity, all the careful control she had maintained since arriving at Blackthorn Hall, finally shattering. They clung to each other in the ruined greenhouse while rain fell through the broken roof and the wind howled like something dying outside. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, his forehead rested against hers. This will end badly, he whispered. I know. I cannot promise you happiness. I cannot even promise you safety. I am not asking for promises. He pulled back to look at her, searching her face for something. What are you asking for? This, just this, whatever we can have before the darkness takes it. Something in his expression shifted, softened in a way she had never seen before. You are braver than I am. No, I just have less to lose. They stayed in the greenhouse until the storm passed, holding each other in the dark, speaking in whispers about things they had never told anyone. She learned that his mother had died when he was 12, that his father had been a tyrant who ruled the house with an iron fist, that Lucian had learned early to hide everything he felt behind a mask of cold control. He learned that she had been left at the charity school as an infant, that she had no memory of any family, that she had spent her whole life feeling like a ghost passing through other people's stories. By the time they returned to the house, something fundamental had shifted between them. The servants noticed immediately. Sarah gasped when she saw them together in the hallway, their clothes still damp, their hands linked. The news would spread through the house like wildfire. Ilara knew, but she found she did not care. That night, for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Hall, she slept soundly, dreamlessly, a small smile on her face. But peace in such a house could never last long. The trouble came in the form of visitors, arriving unannounced 3 days later in a carriage far grander than the one that had brought Ilara. She was in the library when she heard the commotion. Voices raised in the entrance hall, footsteps echoing on marble. She set down her book and moved quietly to the doorway, staying in shadow where she could observe without being seen. A woman stood in the center of the hall, tall and elegant in a deep blue dress that must have cost more than Ilara had earned in her entire life. Her hair was arranged in elaborate curls, her gloved hands gesturing as she spoke, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Where is he?" the woman demanded of the butler. "Tell Lord Blackthorne that Lady Victoria Ashford is here, and she will not be kept waiting." Lucian appeared at the top of the stairs, descending slowly, his face an unreadable mask. "Victoria, this is unexpected, is it? You have been avoiding my letters for months, Lucien. I decided to come in person to discuss our arrangement." "We have no arrangement." "Your father and mine had an arrangement. Your father is dead, but contracts do not die with men. We were to be married, or have you forgotten?" Ilara felt something cold settle in her stomach. From her position by the library door, she could see Lucian's jaw tighten, the only sign of emotion in his otherwise controlled demeanor. "That arrangement was made without my consent," he said quietly. "I will not honor it. You will honor it, or your family will lose everything. The debts your father accrued before his death are substantial, Lucien. My father holds most of them. Marriage to me is the only way to clear those debts and keep Blackthorne Hall in your family. Surely even you, stubborn as you are, can see the logic in that. I see the trap clearly enough." Victoria's laugh was sharp, cutting. "It is not a trap. It is an opportunity. I am beautiful, well-connected, and bringing a substantial dowry. What more could you want?" Lucian's eyes moved past Victoria, finding Ilara in the shadows. For a moment their gazes locked, and she saw in his face a struggle she understood too well. Duty versus desire, survival versus surrender. "I need time to consider," he said finally, looking back at Victoria. "You have had months to consider, but I am generous. I will give you until the end of the week to make your decision. I will stay here naturally. I assume you have suitable rooms for me and my maid?" "Of course," Lucien said, his voice hollow. Ilara did not wait to hear more. She slipped away from the library and fled to her room, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She stood by her window, hands pressed against the glass, trying to breathe through the panic rising in her chest. Of course there would be someone like Victoria. Of course there would be contracts and debts and obligations that mattered more than whatever fragile thing had grown between her and Lucien. She had been a fool to think otherwise, to imagine that a nobody from a charity school could compete with the daughter of a lord. The knock on her door came an hour later. She knew it was him before she opened it, could feel his presence through the wood. "Ilara," he said when she finally let him in, "you do not need to explain." "Yes, I do." He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, looking more exhausted than she had ever seen him. "That contract was my father's doing. He arranged it before he died, trying to shore up the family fortune one last time. I have been fighting it for 2 years, but Victoria's father is powerful, and the debts are real." "So you will marry her?" "I do not know." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "If I refuse, I lose the house, the lands, everything. Hundreds of people depend on this estate for their livelihoods. I cannot simply throw them to the wolves because you want something you cannot have," she finished softly. "No, because I want you more than I want any of this, and that terrifies me." The words hung between them, too large and too true. Ilara felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. "What do you want me to say, Lucien?" "That I understand, that I will wait while you marry someone else and then accept whatever crumbs you can offer me in secret. I cannot do that. I will not be that person." "I am not asking you to be." "Then what are you asking?" He crossed the room and took her hands in his grip almost painful in its intensity. "I am asking you to trust me, to give me until the end of the week to find a solution. And if there is no solution?" His silence was answer enough. She pulled her hands free and turned away, facing the window again. "You should go. Lady Victoria is waiting, and I am sure she has much to discuss with you regarding your future together. Ilara, please go." He left, and the quiet that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. The next 3 days were a particular kind of torment. Victoria claimed Blackthorne Hall as if it were already hers, sweeping through rooms with the confidence of ownership, making suggestions for improvements, discussing plans with servants who nodded and agreed because what else could they do? She treated Alara with polite indifference when they crossed paths, as if the younger woman was simply another piece of furniture, hardly worth noticing. Lucian avoided them both as much as possible, spending long hours locked in his study or riding alone across the moors. When he did appear at meals, he was silent and distant, the cold mask back in place. Alara sat at the far end of the table and pushed food around her plate, unable to eat, unable to do anything but watch the slow destruction of the small happiness she had found. On the third night, unable to sleep, Alara wandered down to the music room. She had not been back since that first night, but she found herself drawn there now, needing to hear the space where something honest had existed between them. The door was unlocked, the room dark except for moonlight streaming through the tall windows. She crossed to the piano and sat on the bench, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. She had told Lucian she could not play, but that was not entirely true. She had taught herself a little at the school, sneaking into the music room during hours when no one else was there, picking out simple melodies by trial and error. She had never been good enough to play for anyone, but she could manage a few things. Her fingers found the notes of a lullaby, something half-remembered from a childhood she could not quite recall. The melody was simple, almost childish, but it felt honest in a way that the grand music of the house did not. She played it through once, then again, losing herself in the repetition. She did not hear Victoria enter until the woman spoke. How quaint. "The little companion plays?" Ilara's hands froze on the keys. She turned to find Victoria standing in the doorway, still dressed in her evening gown, a glass of wine in her hand. "I apologize, my lady. I did not mean to disturb anyone." "You did not disturb me. I do not sleep well in strange houses." Victoria moved into the room, her silk skirts whispering against the floor. "So you are the reason he is being so difficult?" "I do not know what you mean. Please." "I am many things, but I am not blind. The way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching. The way you disappear whenever I enter a room. It is all rather obvious." Victoria took a sip of her wine, studying Alara over the rim of the glass. "You know he will never choose you. You must know that. I have not asked him to choose anything. Perhaps not in words, but your very presence here is a question he cannot answer. Do you really want to be the reason he loses everything? The reason hundreds of people suffer because he was too selfish to do his duty?" The words struck deep, hitting every fear Alara had been trying to ignore. "No," she whispered. "Then leave, tonight. I will give you money, enough to go anywhere you wish, start a new life. All you have to do is disappear before he wakes in the morning." "You cannot buy me like you bought him." Victoria's expression hardened. "I am not buying you, you foolish girl. I am offering you a chance to do the right thing, to leave him free to make the choice he must make without your face haunting him. Is that not what love is? Sacrifice?" Ilara stood, her legs unsteady. "I need to think. Think quickly. The offer expires at dawn." Victoria left as silently as she had arrived, and Ilara sank back onto the piano bench, her mind racing. Everything Victoria had said was true. She was standing in the way of Lucien's duty, his responsibility. If he chose her, he would lose everything, and eventually he would resent her for it. If he chose Victoria, they would both spend the rest of their lives knowing what they had given up. There was no good ending here. There never had been. She made her decisions somewhere in the dark hours before dawn, in that space where night and morning blur together and everything feels equally possible and impossible. She would leave. Not because Victoria had offered money, but because staying would only make Lucian's choice harder. She would take the coward's way out and let him wake to find her gone, leaving him nothing to mourn and no one to blame but himself. She packed her single bag in the pre-dawn darkness, moving quietly through the room that had become almost home. She took nothing that was not hers, leaving the beautiful dresses, the books, all the small gifts that had appeared during her time here. When she was done, the room looked exactly as it had the day she arrived, as if she had never been there at all. She wrote no note. What could she say that would not sound like either blame or begging? The house was silent as she crept down the stairs through the corridors she had learned by heart. She would walk to the village, she decided. It was only a few miles, and from there she could catch a coach to somewhere, anywhere. She had a little money saved from her wages. It would not be enough for long, but it would be a start. She was halfway across the entrance hall when she heard his voice. "Where are you going?" She froze. Lucian stood at the top of the stairs, still dressed in the clothes he had worn the day before, as if he had never gone to bed. His face looked haggard in the dim light, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "I thought it would be easier this way," she said quietly. He descended the stairs slowly, each step deliberate. "Easier for whom?" "For both of us. For everyone. Victoria got to you, it was not a question. She told me the truth, that I am standing in the way of what you have to do. And you believed her. Should I not? You have said yourself that the debts are real, that people depend on this estate. How can I be the reason you lose it all?" He reached the bottom of the stairs and crossed to her, stopping close enough that she could see the pulse jumping in his throat. "Do you know what I spent the last 3 days doing? Not hiding from Victoria or brooding about my fate. I was in my study, going through every account, every deed, every piece of paper my father left behind, trying to find a way out of this trap. And did you find one? I found something better. I found clarity." He took her bag from her hand and set it on the floor, then took both her hands in his. "I will not marry Victoria. I will not trade my life for security, no matter the cost. If I lose Blackthorn Hall, I lose it. If I have to start over with nothing, I will do it. But I will not spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I had been brave enough to choose differently." "Lucian, you cannot—" "I can. I will. But only if you stay. Only if you choose this too, knowing it will be hard. Knowing we will have to build something new from the ashes of everything I am letting burn." Tears finally spilled down her cheeks. All the fear and hope and desperate wanting she had been holding back breaking free. "I have nothing to offer you. No name, no fortune, nothing but myself. You are all I have ever wanted." He kissed her then, gentle this time, a promise rather than hunger. She kissed him back, tasting salt and hope, and the strange, sharp taste of a future she had never let herself imagine. When they broke apart, the sun was beginning to rise through the tall windows, painting the entrance hall in shades of gold and rose. Somewhere in the house, Victoria would be waking, would be discovering that her careful plans had come to nothing. Somewhere, servants were stirring, beginning the routines that kept the great house running. But here, in this moment, none of that mattered. "What will we do?" Elara asked softly. "I do not know. Sell what we can, pay what debts are possible, walk away from the rest. Find a smaller house, a simpler life. It will not be easy. Nothing worth having ever is." He smiled then, the first genuine smile she had ever seen on his face, and it transformed him completely. "You are far too wise for someone so young. And you are far too dramatic for someone so practical. We will be a disaster together. Probably." They stood holding each other as the light grew stronger, as the house woke around them, as the future they had chosen began to take shape in the spaces between heartbeats. When Aunt Constance found them an hour later, still standing in the entrance hall, she said nothing. But Elara thought she saw something like approval in the old woman's eyes before she was wheeled away. Victoria left in a fury of silk and wounded pride, threatening lawsuits and social ruin, but Lucian faced her with the same calm he brought to everything else. "Do what you must," he told her. "I have made my choice." The weeks that followed were strange and difficult and surprisingly joyful. Lucian began the process of liquidating parts of the estate, selling off lands and treasures to pay his father's debts. Some of the servants left, seeking positions in more stable houses, but others stayed, loyal despite the uncertainty. Aunt Constance, her health failing rapidly, watched it all with a satisfaction that seemed to give her strength. "You were right to choose love. Nephew," she told Lucian one afternoon as Elara read to her by the window, "even if it costs everything, especially then." She died 2 weeks later, peacefully in her sleep, and they buried her in the family plot as autumn turned to winter. Elara stood beside Lucian at the graveside, no longer a companion but something else entirely, something the servants whispered about with equal parts scandal and admiration. By the time the first snow fell, Blackthorn Hall was no longer theirs. The debts had been settled, the estate sold to a merchant family with more money than taste. Lucian and Ilara stood on the front drive with a few trunks, watching as the new owners arrived in their carriages, already making plans for changes and improvements. "Any regrets?" Ilara asked quietly. Lucian looked down at her, his arm around her waist, pulling her close against the cold. "None. You?" "None." They walked away from Blackthorn Hall hand in hand, leaving behind the ghosts and the shadows and the weight of a name that had never truly been Lucian's to carry. They walked towards something smaller and warmer, toward a cottage in a village neither of them had ever seen, toward a life they would build together from nothing. It was not the ending anyone would have expected for the Lord of Blackthorn Hall, but it was honest, and it was chosen, and it was theirs. The cottage they found was small and draughty, with a leaking roof and floors that creaked with every step. But it had a garden that faced south and a fireplace that drew well, and rooms enough for what they needed. Lucian found work as a tutor for the local children, teaching them languages and mathematics. Ilara took in sewing and mending, her fingers quick and precise from years of needlework at the school. They were poor by the standards of the world they had left behind, but richer in ways that mattered more. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Lucian reading aloud while Ilara worked, the sound of his voice filling the space where silence used to live. On clear nights, they would walk together through the village, greeting neighbours who knew nothing of titles or estates, who judged them only by the kindness they showed and the work they did. Spring came, bringing warmth and rain and the slow greening of the world. In the garden, Ilara planted vegetables and flowers, her hands in the soil, feeling connected to the earth in a way she never had before. Lucian built a small greenhouse from salvaged glass and wood, and they filled it with roses that bloomed deep red and impossible fragrant. Sometimes, late at night when sleep would not come, they would talk about the past. About the house that was no longer theirs, about the paths not taken, about the people they might have been if they had chosen differently. But these conversations never lasted long. The past was done and the future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but theirs to shape. On a warm evening in late summer, as they sat on the step of their cottage watching the sun set over fields that belonged to someone else, Lucian took her hand and pressed something into her palm. She looked down to find a simple gold band worn smooth with age. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "The only thing I kept from Blackthorn Hall. I thought perhaps if you wanted, if you were willing." She kissed him before he could finish, the ring held tight between their joined hands. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course, yes." They were married by the village priest in a ceremony that lasted less than 10 minutes, with the baker and his wife standing as witnesses. Ilara wore a simple dress she had made herself, white cotton with wildflowers tucked into her hair. Lucian wore the same black suit he wore every day, threadbare at the elbows but clean and pressed. When the priest pronounced them married, they walked out of the church into sunlight that felt like a blessing. That night, in their small bedroom with its narrow bed and patched curtains, they held each other and spoke in whispers about dreams and futures and the strange miracle of finding home in another person. The world outside was vast and mostly indifferent, but here in this small space they had carved out together, everything that mattered fit perfectly. The years passed, measured not in grand events but in small accumulations. A second-hand piano purchased from a travelling merchant, its keys yellowed but its sound true. A cat that adopted them, winding around their ankles and sleeping on the windowsill. A vegetable garden that grew more productive each season as Ilara learned its rhythms. Books added one by one to their small shelf, read and reread until the spines cracked and the pages softened. They had arguments, of course, about money, about work, about the 1,000 small irritations that come from building a life with another person. But they learned to fight fair, to apologize when wrong, to forgive when hurt. They learned that love was not the dramatic feeling that had brought them together in the greenhouse, but the quieter thing that sustained them through ordinary days and difficult seasons. Sometimes travelers would come through the village, people from the world they had left behind, and they would bring news of Blackthorn Hall. The new owners had torn down the greenhouse and built a conservatory. The music room had been converted to a billiard room. The library had been sold off, the books scattered to collectors and shops. Each piece of news was like a small death, a reminder that nothing lasts unchanged. But then Elara would look at Lucien, would see the peace in his face that had never been there in the old life, and she would understand that they had made the right choice. Some things needed to die so other things could live. On the 10th anniversary of their leaving Blackthorn Hall, they made a pilgrimage back to see it. They stood at the gates looking up at the house that loomed dark and somehow smaller than memory had made it. New people moved through the grounds, strangers who knew nothing of the dramas that had played out within those walls. The house had forgotten them as thoroughly as they had tried to forget it. "Do you wish we were still there?" Elara asked, lacing her fingers through his. Lucien was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the windows that no longer reflected anything he recognized. "No," he said finally. "That house was a prison dressed up as a palace. This," he gestured back toward the village, toward the life they had built. "This is freedom." They walked away from Blackthorn Hall for the second and final time, and neither of them looked back. The seasons turned, as seasons do. Winter came with snow that blanketed the village in white silence. Spring returned with its mud and green hope. Summer burned bright and brief. Autumn painted the world in shades of ending. And through it all, they remained constant to each other, weathering storms both literal and metaphorical, finding joy in simple things, building a history together that was theirs alone. They never became wealthy. They never regained the social position they had abandoned. But they became something better. They became themselves fully and completely with all the flaws and beauties that entailed. And in a world that so often demanded performance and pretense, that honesty felt like its own kind of miracle. Years later, when they were old and the cottage had been improved and expanded until it barely resembled the drafty place they had first inhabited, they would sit together in the garden and watch the sunset with the contentment of people who had found what they were looking for. Sometimes children from the village would come to visit, students of Lucien's or customers of Elara's, bringing stories and laughter and reminders that their lives had touched others in ways both small and profound. On one such evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, a young girl asked Elara if she had any regrets about the life she had chosen. Elara looked at Lucien, at the silver in his hair and the lines around his eyes and the way he still looked at her as if she were the most important thing in his world. She thought about the grand house they had left behind, about the wealth and position they had traded for this simple existence. She thought about all the paths not taken, all the different lives they might have lived. "None," she said simply, "not a single one." And in that moment, as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear, she knew it was true. They had started with nothing and built everything that mattered. They had chosen each other over comfort, over security, over all the reasonable arguments for a different path. And that choice, renewed every day in 1,000 small ways, had made all the difference. The story of Lord Blackthorn and the girl from the charity school became a kind of legend in the village, told and retold until the details blurred and shifted, but the heart remained true. It became a story about love that refuses to be reasonable, about sacrifice that leads to grace, about finding home in another person rather than a place. But for Lucien and Elara, it was never a story. It was simply their life, lived moment by moment, day by day, year by year. It was the quiet miracle of choosing each other over and over again, in the face of a world that kept insisting they should choose differently. And in the end, perhaps that was the only story that ever really mattered. Not the grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but the simple act of staying, of building, of loving through all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that make up a human life. As darkness fell completely and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, Elara rested her head on Lucien's shoulder and felt the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. In the cottage behind them, a lamp burned in the window, a golden square of light against the darkness. It was a small light, hardly bright enough to be seen from any distance, but it was theirs, and that was enough. That had always been enough. The letter arrived on a morning when frost still clung to the windows, delivered by a messenger whose fine clothes marked him as someone from beyond the village boundaries. Elara was in the garden, her joints stiff with the cold that came more easily now, when Lucian called to her from the doorway. His voice carried a note she had not heard in years, something between surprise and unease. She came inside, brushing soil from her hands, and found him standing by the table with a piece of thick parchment, sealed with wax she recognized even after all these years. The blackthorn crest, pressed into red wax that gleamed like a wound. "It is from the estate," Lucian said quietly, not looking at her. "The current owner has died. His son wishes to speak with me about matters concerning the original sale." Elara felt something cold settle in her chest. They had built a life so carefully separate from that past, brick by brick, year by year. The thought of it reaching forward to touch them now felt like a violation of something sacred. What could he possibly want after all this time? "I do not know, but the letter suggests it is urgent, and that it concerns both of us." He finally met her eyes, and she saw the same wariness she felt reflected there. "We could ignore it, burn the letter and pretend it never came. Could we?" She moved to the window, looking out at the garden they had tended for decades, at the life they had made. Or would it haunt us, wondering what we refused to know? He came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers with the ease of long habit. "You are right, as usual. We should go. Face whatever this is and be done with it." They travelled to Blackthorn Hall 3 days later, the journey taking longer than Elara remembered, every mile marking the distance between who they had been and who they had become. The countryside had changed in their absence. New roads cutting through old fields, villages expanding, the world moving forward as it always did. But when the hall finally appeared on the horizon, it looked exactly as it had in her memory, dark and imposing against the winter sky. The new master, a young man named Thomas Hartley, received them in the same entrance hall where Elara had once stood with her single bag, ready to flee. He was perhaps 30, with kind eyes and an earnest manner that suggested he had inherited the estate, but not the arrogance that often came with such wealth. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing them toward the library. "I know this must be strange, returning here after so long." The library had been restored, Elara noticed. The books that had been sold off had been replaced with new volumes, their spines stiff and unmarked. It looked like a library, but felt like a stage set, lacking the accumulated weight of the room she remembered. Thomas settled into a chair and indicated they should do the same. "I will be direct, as I sense you would prefer it. My father purchased this estate from you, Lord Blackthorn, and in doing so acquired all the associated papers and documents. After his death, I have been sorting through them, and I discovered something that I believe concerns you both." He pulled out a leather folder and opened it, revealing yellowed documents covered in careful handwriting. "These are records from the charity school where Miss Winters, forgive me, Mrs. Blackthorn, where you spent your childhood. My father acquired them as part of a larger collection of estate papers, though I cannot fathom why. But in reading them, I found something that I believe you should know." Elara felt Lucian's hand tighten on hers. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Your mother did not abandon you at the school, Mrs. Blackthorn. She died there giving birth to you. But before she died, she left instructions that you were to be cared for from a trust she had established. That trust was controlled by a solicitor who, it appears, embezzled the funds and told the school you were a charity case." The words seemed to come from very far away, filtering through layers of time and assumption. Elara had spent her entire life believing she had been unwanted, left like a parcel on a doorstep. The idea that her mother had died trying to provide for her was too large to fit into the space where that old story had lived. "There is more," Thomas continued gently. "Your mother's name was Eleanor Ashford. She was Lady Victoria Ashford's younger sister." The world tilted sideways. Elara heard Lucian's sharp intake of breath beside her, felt his hand grip hers almost painfully tight. Victoria. The woman who had tried to buy her silence, who had offered her money to disappear. Her aunt. "That cannot be right," Elara said, but even as she spoke, pieces were falling into place. The way Victoria had looked at her in the music room, with something that might have been recognition beneath the contempt. The particular cruelty of her offer, as if eliminating Elara from the equation held some personal satisfaction. "I have documentation. Thomas said, sliding papers across the desk. Birth records, letters, the trust papers. Your mother was engaged to be married, but her fiancé died before the wedding. When she discovered she was carrying his child, her family disowned her. She fled to the school, hoping to give birth there and then find work to support you both. But she hemorrhaged during delivery and did not survive. Ilara stared at the documents without seeing them, her mind racing through implications and revelations. She had been nobility all along, or close enough to it. Victoria had known or suspected. That was why she had been so desperate to remove Ilara from Lucien's life, not just as competition for his affection, but as a reminder of the family's shameful secret. Why did she never say anything? Ilara whispered. Why let me believe I was no one? Oh, and perhaps she hoped you would never discover the truth, Lucien said quietly. Or perhaps she convinced herself you were better off not knowing. Thomas cleared his throat. There is one more thing. The trust your mother established. The principal was never touched, only the interest that the solicitor stole. It has been sitting in an account, accruing value for over 50 years. With interest and investments, it has grown to a substantial sum. By law, it belongs to you. Numbers followed, figures that made Ilara's head spin. Enough to buy a grand house, to live in luxury, to reclaim something of the life she might have had if her mother had lived. Enough to change everything. I do not want it, she said immediately. Both men looked at her in surprise. Lucien's expression was unreadable, but she knew him well enough to see the question in his eyes. It is your inheritance, Thomas said carefully. Your mother's gift to you. My mother died trying to provide for me, and I respect that sacrifice. But this money, it represents a life I never lived, a person I never became. I built my life without it. I do not need it now. She looked at Lucien, searching his face for judgment and finding none. Unless you think differently, it is your decision, he said simply. I will support whatever you choose. She turned back to Thomas. Use it for something good. Establish a fund for girls in circumstances like mine. Orphans, unwanted children, those who need education and opportunity. Let my mother's money do the work she hoped it would do. Just for more than one child. Thomas nodded slowly, something like admiration in his expression. That can be arranged. I will have my solicitor draw up the papers to establish a charitable foundation in your mother's name. They left Blackthorn Hall an hour later, walking out into winter sunlight that felt too bright after the dim interior. Neither spoke until they were well down the drive, the house receding behind them like a ship disappearing over the horizon. Are you certain? Lucien asked finally. That was a considerable sum, Ilara. It could have made your life easier. My life is already easy, she said, threading her arm through his. I have everything I need. What would I do with money except worry about it? He laughed, the sound surprising them both. You are remarkable, you know that. No, I am simply practical. And besides, the money was never truly mine. It belonged to a girl who died before she could become me, whose mother imagined a different future for her. I cannot claim that ghost's inheritance. They walked in silence for a while, the cold air sharp in their lungs. Then Ilara said, I have been thinking about Victoria, about what she must have felt seeing me there at Blackthorn Hall. Her sister's bastard child, grown and standing in her way. She still made her choices. She could have told you the truth. She could have. But shame is a powerful thing, Lucien. It makes people into smaller versions of themselves. She paused, considering. I think I would like to write to her. Not to accuse or to reconnect, but simply to let her know that I understand, that I forgive her, if forgiveness is needed. You are a better person than I am. No. Just tired of carrying old angers. We do not have enough years left to waste them on bitterness. The letter to Victoria took Ilara a week to write, each word chosen with care. She told her aunt, strange to even think the word, that she knew the truth, that she bore no ill will, that she hoped Victoria had found some measure of peace in her life. She did not expect a response, and she did not receive one. But 3 months later, a package arrived at the cottage, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Inside was a miniature portrait, small enough to fit in Ilara's palm. A young woman with dark hair and eyes that looked hauntingly familiar stared out from the painted surface, her expression caught between hope and sorrow. On the back, written in shaking handwriting, was a single line: "Your mother, Eleanor. She was beautiful and brave, and she loved you before she ever met you." Ilara placed the portrait on the mantel, where she could see it from her chair by the fire. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, she would study that painted face and wonder about the woman who had given her life, who had died hoping to give her daughter a better future. The wondering was bittersweet, but it felt important somehow. This acknowledgement of the past. Spring came late that year, the ground slow to thaw, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it an unexpected visitor. Ilara was hanging laundry in the garden when she saw a figure approaching down the lane, a woman walking with purpose despite the mud. As she drew closer, Ilara recognized her, Sarah, the servant from Blackthorn Hall, now grey-haired and bent, but with the same quick eyes. "Miss Winters," Sarah said, then caught herself. "Mrs. Blackthorn, I mean. Forgive me. Old habits. Sarah, this is a surprise. Please come inside." Ilara led her into the cottage, settled her by the fire with tea, and waited while the older woman gathered her thoughts. "I heard you had returned to the hall," Sarah said finally. "The talk in the servants' quarters is all about it, how you came back after all these years. And I thought, well, there are things you should know. Things I should have told you long ago but was too afraid to speak." "What things?" Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. "About the night Lord Blackthorn's father died. About what really happened in this house before you arrived." The story Sarah told was dark and twisted, a tale of cruelty and manipulation that spanned decades. Lucian's father had been a tyrant, as they had known, but the depths of his abuse went far beyond what they had imagined. He had driven Lucian's mother to despair, had broken her spirit so thoroughly that when she finally died, it was almost a relief. And he had done the same to countless others. Servants, tenants, anyone who fell under his power. But the night he died, Sarah said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, was different. There was a storm, worse than anything I had seen before or since. Lightning struck the east wing, set afire. In the chaos, the master went to his study to retrieve his papers, his precious documents proving his debts and deals. But he never came out. They found him the next morning, collapsed at his desk. His heart simply stopped. "That sounds like natural causes," Ilara said slowly. "It would, if not for what I saw." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes intense. "I was up that night helping fight the fire. I saw Lord Lucian go into that study. I saw him stand in the doorway watching his father struggle with his papers, clearly in distress, clearly needing help. And I saw Lord Lucian turn away and lock the door from the outside." The words hung in the air like smoke. Ilara felt something cold spread through her chest, not horror exactly, but a kind of profound understanding. She thought of Lucian as she knew him, gentle, careful, haunted by his past. She thought of the man capable of walking away from everything he had been raised to value. And she realized that Sarah's story did not change anything essential about who he was. "You let him die," she said softly, not a question. "I did not kill him. I simply chose not to save him." Sarah's voice was steady. "I have carried that knowledge for decades, wondering if I should have spoken, if I should have told someone. But I saw what that man did to this family, to everyone around him, and I thought perhaps the world was better without him in it. Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you came back. Because I saw that you still love Lord Lucien after all these years, and I thought you deserved to know the truth about the man you married. Not the lord of the manor, but the man who was capable of watching his father die and feeling nothing but relief." After Sarah left, Ilara sat by the fire for a long time, staring into the flames. When Lucian returned from the village, she told him about the visit, about what Sarah had revealed. She watched his face as she spoke, seeing the way something old and heavy settled over his features. "It is true," he said when she finished. "I have never spoken of it, never even allowed myself to think of it clearly. But that night when I saw him there gasping and clutching at his chest, I knew I could open that door. I could call for help, and I chose not to. I chose to let nature take its course. Do you regret it?" He was quiet for a long moment. I regret that I was ever in a position where that choice felt necessary. I regret that I did not have the courage to simply leave earlier, to free myself from him before it came to that. But do I regret that he died? No. The world is better without men like him in positions of power. Ilara moved to sit beside him, taking his hand. I understand. You do not judge me for it. How can I judge you for surviving the only way you knew how? She pressed her cheek against his shoulder. We all do what we must to escape our prisons. You simply waited for the door to open on its own. They sat together in silence, holding each other while the fire burned low and shadows lengthened across the room. Outside, spring rain began to fall, washing the world clean. The revelation changed nothing between them, but somehow made everything clearer. They had both been shaped by circumstances beyond their control, both forced to make impossible choices. The difference was that they had found each other in the aftermath, had built something together that was not defined by what they had survived, but by how they chose to live now. Summer brought heat and growth, the garden flourishing under Ilara's care. She was working among the roses one afternoon when she heard raised voices from inside the cottage. She hurried in to find Lucien facing a young man she did not recognize, both of them standing tense and angry in the front room. "Who is this?" she asked. "My cousin," Lucien said, his voice tight. "Richard Blackthorne. Apparently the family has decided to make contact after all these years of silence." Richard was perhaps 25, with the Blackthorne features, the same grey eyes, the same angular face, but lacking the weight of experience that made Lucien's countenance so compelling. He looked at Ilara with barely concealed contempt. "So this is the woman you threw everything away for." "A servant. My wife," Lucien said quietly, but with steel beneath the words. "And you will speak to her with respect, or leave immediately. I came to offer you a chance to reclaim your position in the family. My father is dying, and he wishes to make amends before the end. He is prepared to clear your name, to restore your title and lands, to give you back everything you should have had." In exchange for what? A simple thing. Set aside this marriage. It was never legitimate in the eyes of the family. Marry properly to someone of appropriate station and take your rightful place. The audacity of it left Ilara momentarily speechless. After decades, after everything they had built together, the family thought they could simply erase it all with an offer of lands and titles. "No," Lucien said, the word absolute. "You are a fool. You would choose this." Richard gestured dismissively at the cottage, at Ilara, at the simple life they had made. "Over your birthright. Every single time. Every moment of every day without hesitation or regret." Lucien moved to stand beside Ilara, his arm around her waist. "I chose this life, Richard. I chose her. And that choice is the only thing I have ever done that I am truly proud of. You will die poor and forgotten. I will die happy and loved, which is more than you will ever understand." Richard left in a storm of outrage and disbelief, and they watched him go without speaking. When the sound of his horse had faded completely, Ilara turned to Lucien and found him smiling, actually smiling, with a lightness she rarely saw. "That felt good," he admitted. "After all these years, to simply say no to everything they represent. You are sure? You do not wonder what might have been?" "I know exactly what might have been. I lived it for the first 30 years of my life, and it nearly destroyed me." He cupped her face in his hands, looking at her with such tenderness that she felt tears prick at her eyes. "You saved me, Ilara, not from poverty or obscurity, but from becoming my father. From becoming the kind of man who values power over love, possession over partnership. If that is not worth everything, then nothing is." That night, they lay in their narrow bed and talked until dawn about the strange trajectory of their lives. About the doors that had closed and the windows that had opened. About the peculiar grace of finding exactly what you need in the last place you thought to look. And somewhere in those quiet hours, Ilara realized that they had finally, truly left Blackthorne Hall behind. Not the building, but the weight of it, the claim it had held on their imaginations. They were free in a way they had never quite been before. Autumn arrived with its familiar melancholy beauty, the trees turning gold and red, the air sharp with the promise of winter. Elara and Lucien had fallen into the comfortable rhythms of age, their bodies slower but their connection deeper, refined by decades of shared experience. They no longer needed words for many things. A glance across the room conveyed entire conversations. It was on a morning when mist lay thick over the fields that Thomas Hartley returned, bringing with him news that would shift the ground beneath them once more. He sat in their small parlour, accepted tea with the same earnest politeness he had shown before, and then delivered his message with careful gentleness. "The foundation we established in your mother's name has grown considerably," he told Elara. "The investments have done well, and we have been able to help hundreds of young women over the past years. But there is something else, something I discovered recently that I believe you should know." He withdrew a letter from his coat, old paper gone brittle with age. "This was hidden among your mother's effects, which were stored at Blackthorn Hall after her death. It is addressed to you to be opened on your 50th birthday. You are well past that age now, but better late than never." Elara took the letter with trembling hands. Her mother's handwriting, she realised. She had seen examples of it in the documents Thomas had shown them before. The writing was shaky, clearly done in great pain or haste, but legible. She read it aloud, Lucian's hand warm on her shoulder. "My dearest daughter, if you are reading this, then I am gone and you have lived to see your 50th year. I pray you have found happiness, though I know the circumstances of your birth may have made that difficult. I want you to know that you were not a mistake or a shame, but the greatest gift I ever received. Your father was a good man, kind and gentle, and he would have loved you fiercely if he had lived to see you born. I am leaving you what money I have, not as payment or apology, but as a foundation. Build something beautiful with it. Build a life that is yours alone, not defined by what I could not give you or what society says you should be. Be brave, my darling girl. Be braver than I was. Love deeply and without apology. Take risks. Make mistakes. Live a life so full that when you reach the end of it, you look back with satisfaction rather than regret. I wish I could be there to see the woman you become, but I will carry the hope of you into whatever comes next. You are loved. You have always been loved. Never doubt that. Your mother, Eleanor." By the time Elara finished reading, her cheeks were wet with tears. She folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest, feeling the weight of her mother's love across the gulf of decades and death. Lucian pulled her close and she let herself cry in a way she rarely allowed, for the mother she never knew, for the loss that had shaped her entire existence, for the strange gift of receiving these words now. When she was old enough to truly understand them, "She would have been proud of you," Thomas said quietly. "Of what you have built, of who you have become. The foundation bearing her name has changed lives, and that is a legacy worth more than any fortune." After he left, Elara sat by the window with the letter in her lap, reading it again and again until she had memorized every word. Her mother's voice, preserved on paper, speaking directly to her across the years, telling her that she had been loved, that she had been wanted, that her existence had meant something even in the brief hours before Eleanor's death. "I followed her advice," Elara said to Lucian that evening as they sat by the fire. "I did not know it, but I lived the life she hoped I would live. I loved deeply. I took risks. I made my own path. She would have liked you," Lucian said, "and been impressed by your strength. I wonder if she knew somehow. If dying women have some gift of sight that lets them see forward. If she looked at me and saw not just an infant, but the woman I would become. Perhaps, or perhaps she simply hoped, and you fulfilled that hope by being exactly who you needed to be." The letter became another treasure on their mantel, placed next to the miniature portrait. Together they formed a kind of shrine to the past, not worshipped but acknowledged, given its proper place in the story of Elara's life. Winter came early that year, snow falling in thick sheets that transformed the village into something from a fairy tale. Elara and Lucian stayed close to the fire, venturing out only when necessary, content to pass the short days in each other's company. They read together, played cards, talked about memories that seemed to grow more precious as they aged. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Lucien began to tell her stories she had never heard before, tales from his childhood that he had kept locked away for decades. He spoke of his mother, Not the broken woman who had died young, but the person she had been before his father destroyed her. A woman who loved music and poetry, who had dreams of her own before they were crushed beneath the weight of an unhappy marriage. "She used to take me to the greenhouse," he said, staring into the fire as if seeing the past in the flames. "Before my father forbade it, she would show me the roses and tell me their names like they were friends of hers. She said that living things needed gentleness to thrive, that you could not force beauty, only nurture it. Is that why you built a greenhouse for me?" He looked at her then, his eyes soft with emotion. "I suppose it was. Trying to give you what was taken from her. Trying to be different than he was." "You succeeded," Elara said firmly. "You are nothing like your father. Only because you made me better. Only because you showed me what love without possession looks like." They lapsed into comfortable silence, watching the snow fall beyond the window. Outside, the world was turning white and quiet, muffling all the sharp edges of reality. Inside, the fire crackled and warm light filled the room, and they sat together as they had sat 1,000 times before, content in the simple miracle of presence. As the year turned and a new one began, they received news that Lady Victoria Ashford had died in her sleep. There was no funeral invitation. They had never reconciled enough for that, but Elara felt the loss, nonetheless. Her aunt, difficult and proud and damaged by her own family's cruelty, had carried secrets and shame until the very end. Elara said a quiet prayer for her, hoping that death had brought her some measure of peace that life had denied. Spring returned as it always did, bringing renewal and the promise of warmth. The garden came back to life under Elara's patient care, green shoots pushing through soil that had seemed dead and frozen. She worked among the plants with the same dedication she had shown for decades. Her movements slower now, but no less certain. One morning, as she was pruning the roses, she felt a sharp pain in her chest that took her breath away. She stood very still, waiting for it to pass, and gradually it did, leaving her shaken but functional. She said nothing to Lucian, not wanting to worry him, but she knew. The body has its own language, and hers was beginning to speak of endings. She was more careful after that, pacing herself, resting when she needed to. But she also became more intentional, as if aware that time was growing short and there were things that needed to be completed. She wrote letters to people they had known over the years, small notes of gratitude and connection. She organized their papers, making sure everything was in order. She spent long hours in the garden, not working so much as being, absorbing the beauty of the world she would eventually have to leave. Lucian noticed, of course. He knew her too well to miss the subtle changes. The way she touched objects as if memorizing them. The way she looked at him sometimes with such intensity it was almost frightening. "Talk to me," he said one evening. "Tell me what you are thinking." She considered deflecting, then decided against it. They had built their life on honesty, and she would not abandon that now. "I am thinking that we have been very lucky. That we were given more than most people ever get. Decades of love and partnership and ordinary miracles. And I am thinking that everything ends eventually, and we should be grateful for what we had rather than greedy for more." "You are not well." "I am as well as I can be at this age. But I am realistic, Lucian. We are old. Our bodies are wearing out. That is simply the nature of living." He pulled her close, holding her with a fierceness that belied his own age. "I am not ready to lose you. I know I am not ready either. But ready or not, we do not get to choose the timing. We only get to choose how we spend the time we have left." "Then how do you want to spend it?" She pulled back to look at him, seeing in his face all the years they had shared, all the love and struggle and growth. "Exactly as we have been, together, paying attention, making every moment count, not by doing anything extraordinary, but by being fully present for the ordinary." They fell into a new rhythm after that conversation, one marked by acute awareness. They paid attention to everything, the quality of morning light, the taste of tea, the sound of each other's breathing. They took nothing for granted, blessing each day as the gift it was. And in that heightened state of presence, they found a kind of joy that went beyond happiness. It was the joy of completion, of a story well told, of having lived fully and with intention. They had started with nothing and built everything that mattered. They had chosen love over comfort, authenticity over approval, and that choice had made all the difference. The seasons continued their eternal dance, indifferent to human concerns. Summer arrived with its abundance, the garden overflowing with vegetables and flowers. Elara and Lucien spent long evenings on the small bench they had placed among the roses, watching the sun set in spectacular displays of orange and purple and gold. "Do you remember the first time we spoke?" Elara asked one such evening. "In the library at Blackthorn Hall. You were on a ladder, reaching for a book on the highest shelf. You looked terrified. I was terrified. Of you, of the house, of everything. I had no idea how to be around someone like you. And now?" She laughed softly. "Now you are just the person I share my life with." The extraordinary became ordinary, but in the best possible way. "I miss that house sometimes," Lucien admitted. Not the weight of it, but the beauty. The library, the music room, the way light fell through the windows in the afternoon. "I wonder if it is wrong to miss the prison that held you." "It is not wrong. We can acknowledge what was beautiful about it without wishing we were still there. Memory is kinder than reality ever was." They sat in companionable silence, watching the light fade and stars begin to appear. A gentle breeze carried the scent of roses, and somewhere in the distance a bird sang its evening song. The world was full of small beauties, and they had learned to notice all of them. As autumn arrived again, painting the world in familiar golds and reds, they celebrated their anniversary quietly, as they always did. Decades had passed since they had spoken vows in the village church, but the commitment had only deepened with time. They had learned each other completely, the good and the difficult, the strengths and the flaws, and chosen to stay anyway, day after day, year after year. "What is your secret?" a young bride from the village asked Elara once, seeking advice about marriage. Elara thought carefully before answering. "There is no secret, only choices made every day. The choice to be kind even when you are angry. The choice to listen even when you think you already know. The choice to value the partnership more than being right. And the choice to remember why you started this journey together, especially when the road gets difficult. Is that enough? If you are with the right person, yes. If you are with the wrong person, nothing is enough." The young woman left, looking both reassured and uncertain, and Elara smiled at the memory of her own young self, just as uncertain, just as hopeful. Life was a mystery that could only be solved by living it, one day at a time. Winter returned with its customary chill, and this time Elara felt it more keenly than she had in previous years. Her bones ached with the cold, her movements slower and more careful. She spent more time by the fire, wrapped in shawls, content to watch the world through the window rather than venture out into it. Lucien tended to her with the same devotion she had always shown him, bringing tea and adjusting cushions and reading aloud when she was too tired to hold a book herself. The roles had reversed gradually over the years, and now he was the primary caregiver, a position he accepted with grace and tenderness. "You are too good to me," she murmured one afternoon, half dozing by the fire. "Impossible. There is no such thing as too good when it comes to you." She smiled, her eyes closed, feeling utterly safe and cherished. This, she thought, was what love looked like at the end. Not passion or drama or grand gestures, but simple care given freely. Someone willing to tend your failing body with the same attention they once devoted to winning your heart. On a particularly cold night, when wind howled around the cottage and snow piled against the windows, Elara woke from sleep with absolute clarity. She understood in that moment that her time was drawing short. Not tomorrow, perhaps not even next week, but soon. The knowledge did not frighten her. Instead, it brought a strange peace, a sense of rightness. She turned in the darkness to look at Lucien, sleeping beside her as he had for so many years. His face in repose looked younger, the worry lines smoothed away. She studied his features, memorizing them one final time, then placed her hand over his heart and felt its steady beat. "Thank you," she whispered, so quietly he did not wake. "For everything, for seeing me, for choosing me, for building this life with me." Morning came eventually, as mornings do, and they rose to face another day. But something had shifted in the night. Some invisible line crossed. They both felt it, though neither spoke of it directly. Instead, they moved through their routines with extra care, savouring each moment as if it might be their last together. If this story found a reflection in you, leave a comment and share it. Sometimes the quietest pain is the most human.